Good morning to those tuning in from North America. Good afternoon to those tuning in from Israel. Welcome. This is the second class of Lessons and Legacies in Masechet Avot with Rabbi Yonatan Kohn. This class is a project of Drishas Rivka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in the memory of Rivka Rosenwein by her family. In this course, we will explore subtle linguistic and editorial elements of Masechet Avot to gain a glimpse into the world of the sages, how they studied, taught, and acted as custodians of the tradition. Through a careful study of lesser-known teachings from Avot, in light of compelling textual traditions, particularly those of Avot de Rabbi Natan and the other, quote, minor tractates, and medieval commentaries, we will uncover an Avot as intellectually profound as it is spiritual, with special attention being paid to the 15th century commentary of the Rashbatz. For those who have not had the pleasure of learning with him before, Yonatan Kohn is a doctoral student in the Department of History of the Jewish People at Ben-Gurion University. His dissertation explores the writings of Rabbi Shimon ben Zemach Duran. He is a Musmach of Yeshiva University's Gross Institute and has taught at several schools and yeshivot. He works as a writer, translator, and editor, and lives in Yad Binyamin. Handouts will be posted in chat shortly later as classes goes underway. And I'm going to just send promotions to panelists so that people who are here and want to turn on their camera, show their face, ask questions directly can do so. And we do want to hear questions. Please do not hesitate to ask questions in chat. And with that, I do want to hand things over to you, Rabbi Kohn.
Okay, good morning and good afternoon. Again, thank you very much to Kayla for all of the technical aspects, making sure we're smooth and running. And I want to apologize from the outset for the lack of sources and the way that you normally receive them in the most friendly and accessible way. That's on me. I didn't get them to Kayla in time, but hopefully I'll get them soon. And in the meantime, if it's not too much of a distraction and a problem, I'm happy to share them from my own screen with you. So we'll go ahead and do that right from the. You know what? Let's hold off on that for just a moment. A quick recap, perhaps, of last week's class. I'm going to have a challenge of controlling myself over the next few weeks, as I did last week. Like I said, really every Mishnah Avot, I hope that I've convinced you of that already, at least a little bit. Every Mishnah Avot is worth the time that you put into it, and that could be a lot of time. If I could design it myself, I would say get a 110-hour course on learning Masechet Avot as a minimum, really, because each Mishnah is a good hour and more. Just sink your teeth into it, and it's one of these things where the closer you look at it, the more and more and more you notice. You get your synapses really flaring and sink yourself into the material, and it absolutely opens it up in a way which cannot be repeated through a superficial, kind of like little train ride. Oh look, I saw that thing, kind of like taking a tourist bus or something. You're not really going to get the flavor of whatever city it is that you're looking at. Nonetheless, hopefully, flashing lights and sounds as you pass by are enough to encourage you to come back again and knock on those doors and enter those facades. That said, what we started to do last week is we got a little bit of a better appreciation, hopefully, for the language of the particular Mishnayot, and I'm not speaking specifically about the Aramaic. That we saw that was our the Mishnah that we focused on last week was Hillel's Mishnah in the first parak, which he spoke in Aramaic. The Mishnah quoted him as speaking in Aramaic, and as we pointed out, he's from Bavel. Aramaic is his native language, and he composed it with a certain kind of rhyme, which is not so unusual actually in the Mishnah. Even in Hebrew we have that, where a Mishnah might be composed and edited in such a way as to be not necessarily musical, but to appeal to the ear and to also run off the tongue. But more than that, we also saw that there's a certain interconnectedness between the Mishnayot in terms of the language that pours. And the first parak of Avot, really from one generation to the next, or one era to the next, which is the way that the first chapter of Masechet Avot unfolds. That we start with the era of Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, and we move step by step until we get to the end of the parak, where we're introduced to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. We didn't see his Mishnah last week, but that was really the continuity through Hillel and Shammai, and then after Hillel and Shammai, the Mishnah concluded. The first chapter concludes with the teachings of a descendant of Hillel, and that is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So if we pick up where we left off in the chain of the tradition last week, then the next great figure is Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And at this point, I will share my sources. I hope you have the document in front of you. Is that right?
I can see.
Okay. Excellent. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So let's start at the beginning. The source number one over here, you'll notice, is from Masechet Sofrim. Last week we mentioned briefly the Masechtot Ktanot, the minor tractates, which historically we know they're old. We know they're they were written more than 1,000 years ago, but exactly when is up in the air a little bit, debated by the historians. One of those, quote, minor tractates is Masechet Sofrim. If you like to have a book in your hand and you want to see where you can find it in a book without having to buy a specialized source, so the minor tractates are printed at the end of the volume of the Vilna Shas, the Vilna Talmud, which is the standard edition of the Talmud, at the end of the volume of Masechet Avodah Zarah. Normally it's there. And you see these, they're different. You see they're different. They're not written in Aramaic. So they're not exactly Gemara. They're not Gemara. That's why they're called the minor tractates, not part of the Talmud. And yet it is rabbinic material, collections of Braitot, which occasionally do find their way into the discussions in the Talmud and the Gemara, Masechet Sofrim in particular. Sofrim, of course, is scribes. So the Masechet of scribes, this collection of Braitot, shows up it's not the most unfamiliar figure, and is quoted with some frequency, in particular in Masechet Brachot, because we have a lot of laws of tefillah. Just a little shout out today. Some people, it's Yom Ha'atzmaut, some people, many congregations recite Hallel. And the discussions in the contemporary post-game halachic authorities about whether Hallel is appropriate for Yom Ha'atzmaut will often center around a Braita on Masechet Sofrim, which tells us, it enumerates the days on which we say Hallel. Okay. In any case, so that's a little bit of Masechet Sofrim. Yes.
You said over 1,000 years ago.
Yes.
That seemed, I mean, I'm ignorant on this, but wasn't it like 1,500 years ago?
Good. So it's not clear. It's not clear that the Masechet Sofrim, at least in the form that we have it, I should say all the minor tractates. I'm glad you stopped me on that. It's not clear that they're quite as old as the Talmud Bavli. Talmud Bavli is about 1,500 years old. The way that the minor tractates are presented, they're presented basically as Braitot. They're in Hebrew. They seem to have the same formula, basically the format of the Mishnah or the Tosefta, which are prior to the Talmud. In other words, they should be older than 1,500 years. However, in their current form and the way that we have them, the editing, it's not clear that the editing was done really before then. And so some historians say that the minor tractates, the Masechtot Ktanot, were really put together, or at least in their current form, edited to close to their current form, really after the sealing of the Talmud in the times of the Savoraim, or maybe even the Geonim. That's why I say at least 1,000 years, right? We know that they're very old. Are they 1,400 years ago, 1,800 years ago? That I can't say, and there's no consensus on that. But I would say, certainly over 1,000 years. In other words, they would predate the Rishonim for sure.
Because 1,000 years ago was Rashi.
Right. Yeah, they predate the Rishonim. They're before. I said 1,000 to give a safe number. It's more than 1,000.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sure. So we'll learn. This is amazing. If I mention the name Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, so I think in general, and it's a great question. I mentioned this last week also, is how much biography should influence our reading of a particular teaching in Masechet Avot. Sometimes it will enrich our understanding of the Mishnah profoundly. I think this is one of those times. So in order to appreciate the Mishnah that we're going to study today, the few Mishnah which are taught by Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, first we need to get a little bit of a sense of whom he is. I'm sorry. Before we even dive into this first Braita, maybe I'll just throw out there the name Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Actually, I'm in Jerusalem today. I happen to be. And as I was walking to the place where I'm currently sitting down, I noticed a sign for a street, Ben Zakkai Street. So I thought that was really exciting. Besides being a street in Yerushalayim, what else do we know about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai? There's one thing which is probably the most famous biographical piece of information that's kind of well known about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai.
Ein li yavne v'chachameha.
Perfect. Tein li yavne v'chachameha. Thank you. I just want to point out that Deborah I have not paid or fed Deborah the questions or the answers beforehand, but I appreciate very much your contributions here. So Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is probably most famous for saying, "Give me Yavne and its sages." The context of that declaration and what exactly that means is it shows up in Masechet Gitin. In the 5th chapter, there are descriptions of the destruction of the Second Temple. And Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was the great rabbinic leader of the Jewish people in Jerusalem at the time of the siege of Jerusalem and ultimately the destruction of the temple. And Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai has this terrible dilemma of how he should respond to the impending disaster and destruction. And we see elsewhere from the Talmud that really haunted him throughout the rest of his life, that he doesn't know if he chose right. It's this kind of, two paths, the lesser of two evils. And ultimately, he felt that Jerusalem could not be saved at that point. The destruction it could not be stopped. And so he had to try to figure out what he could do to at least, the Gemara says, to save a little bit, to preserve something of the Jewish tradition, as a buoy on the water to kind of survive even after the storm passes. And so one of the things that he devises a trick to escape from Jerusalem, from the walls of Jerusalem, to meet with Vespasian, who was the commanding officer of the Roman soldiers, the Roman legions camped around Jerusalem. And he has this personal interview with Vespasian, and he makes 3 demands, and one of them is, "Give me Yavne and its sages." But really, so he is at the center of not that he's responsible for it, but he's the leading figure that kind of preserves the Jewish tradition in the face of this massive destruction. And his strategy is to create a new seat for the Jewish leadership and a safe place for them to study and continue to transmit the tradition in Yavne, which is a small town somewhere west of Jerusalem. And on the map in Israel today, you'll find 3 or 4 different places bearing the name Yavne, all somewhat near to Ashdod. Gan Yavne and the city Yavne, where there's an ice cream factory. and Kvutzat Yavne, where they make pickles, Yeshivat Kerem B'Yavne. Okay, that's what he's most famous for. So he is the really, in some senses, the figure who saves the tradition. Okay, we know that in the background, and now let's read the text from source number 1. Amru alav al Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, shelo hiniach parsha achat b'Torah shelo lamda, v'lamad b'mikra v'targum midrash halachot v'agadot, u'mashalo hakol lamad. V'chein amru alav she'amar im yu kol hashamayim yiriot, v'chol ha'ilanot kulmusin, v'chol hayamim dio, enan kedei lichtov et chachmati shelamaditi merabotai. V'lo atzalti michochmatan ela keshem she'azvuv hazo hatovelet b'yam hagadol u'mashu mechasra u'mimikibel Torah mihilel mishamai. I couldn't resist myself, having seen this source once, I could not resist sharing it, just because of the beauty of the and elegance of the source. It was related of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai that he did not neglect the study of a single passage of the Torah. He studied all scripture, Targum, that's the Aramaic translation, Mishnah, Halachot, and Agadot, and all of what we would say, certainly in their time, of the tradition, all the written tradition, the oral tradition. He learned everything. It was also related of him that he declared, if all the heavens were sheets, all the trees quills, and all the seas ink, they would not suffice for recording my wisdom which I acquired from my masters. In other words, I know a lot. I know so much more than I could possibly ever even begin to write. So much more. Now, it sounds like it's bragging, but his point is this. And yet I have gained no more of the wisdom of the sages than a fly acquires, which dips in the great sea and deprives it of the tiniest drop. So imagine a fly going over the Pacific Ocean and just taking a little dip. And then the fly emerges from the ocean, and how wet is that fly? How much moisture is on that fly? And this, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says, that's me, I'm the little fly, the wet fly. And I've got so much, I could not possibly ever write it all, ever. But it's just a tiny little drop. From whom did he receive the Torah? From Hillel and Shammai. So this is the next figure in this chain that we first encountered last week. Okay, the source we just read is Masechet Sofrim. And the Gemara has a similar description, Masechet Sukkah in the Talmud Bavli, and we'll read that one as well. And then,
Excuse me.
well, yeah, please.
What is the subject of Masechet Sofrim? This is gorgeous. What else do you find in Masechet Sofrim? I'm intrigued.
So the Masechta Ktanot in general have this kind of narrative, which to me is very appealing. It's not the same. It doesn't have the same rhythm as the Mishnah, so you'll get a little bit more story, a little bit more color. But Masechet Sofrim is highly technical. It's a legal. It is a legal collection, and like I said, it has a lot of the regulations of the tefillah. What I really I've kind of put together these sources, and I have my own approach in Masechet Avot in putting Avot side by side with the other sources. It's a good opportunity for me to explain my methodology just a little bit more. I taught for about 4 years in Chappelle's Darchei Noam, which is an adult men's yeshiva in Yerushalayim. It's a wonderful experience. I really love teaching adults. And one of the things I'm most grateful for is that spending that time there, I really started to look at the Gemara with more patience and with wider eyes than I had ever done before. As a teacher, I had smicha already. I had taught even Gemara and other yeshivot, but I had never really thrown myself into it with as much patience as I did then. And all of a sudden, I came to new appreciations and understandings. And one of the tools that I guess I collected in my bag, being around the other amazing staff there and the incredible students, was I came to this little mashal I would describe to my students about how the speakers in the Gemara, the Amoraim, how they went about their study. And basically, I came to this. The Amoraim is the era, the group of the centuries really of sages of the tradition that came after the Tanaim. Okay, the Tanaim we'll mention hopefully today completed the Mishnah around the year 200, and then the next era was the era of the Amoraim. The year 200, one of the reasons the Mishnah finished the time that it did, and we also have a competing Talmud. We normally, when we talk about the Gemara, the Talmud, we have the Babylonian Talmud. There's also a Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. There are many differences between these two massive volumes, collections, too many differences. But the Talmud Yerushalmi is a little bit earlier, and yet, even though it's earlier, it's considered somewhat less authoritative because, and traditionally we say, it was never properly completed because of the conditions, the economic conditions and the political conditions of life at the time in Eretz Yisrael, in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era in Eretz Yisrael. So the Talmud Yerushalmi was kind of never quite finished. But the Amoraim in Eretz Yisrael and in Bavel, when they came to the Mishnah, they had a lot of questions. The Mishnah was written in shorthand, and you have to apply the Mishnah to a changing world. You have to also answer the questions from in between the text, the questions that are not answered. So the Amoraim said, we have this amazing material, and what do we do with it? And then they said something else also. I gave this mashal in Chappelle's many times. I said, imagine somebody who's crazy about a rock group, a groupie, somebody who's crazy about their band, and you walk into the room where they compose their music. You walk into their archive, but it's a bit of a mess. On the table, you have some notes, but then you have notes in different boxes in different places. And you know that on the table, that's the stuff that those are the songs that they published. Those are the songs you already know, right? The songs that were produced by the big record labels. But then you have this cut and that cut. And today, just driving today with my family, my son likes In the Hall of the Mountain King, a famous classical music piece. In the hall, somehow I taught him this piece, and every time we get in the car, he wants to hear it. So I was driving, so I wasn't controlling the music, but my wife sitting next to me, she was controlling music. So she puts into Spotify In the Hall of the Mountain King. And then for the next 20 minutes, we hear 6 different versions of In the Hall of the Mountain King. Okay, it's not quite the same, but there is some similarity. In other words, you have this thing that you love, and you know what the classical one is, but if you're so obsessed with it, then you want to hear the variations also. So in the Amoraim walk into the room of the Tanaim, and they see the Mishnah on the table. And the Mishnah is what the Tanaim signed and sealed. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is the editor of the Mishnah, and that was the most authoritative version of everything the Tanaim taught, and they loved it. But, like I said, they had a lot of questions, but also they revered the Tanaim. You hear the way Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai described his teachers. He revered his teachers, and he wanted to get more and more from this ocean. So the Amoraim walk into the room, and there's all these scraps. And they know that there's the authorized version on the table, but when you look at the scraps also, then that helps you to flesh out the picture. It helps you to balance a little bit. And sometimes, even if you know this is just a scrap, so you know it's discarded, but it helps you to understand the version on the table a little better. Or sometimes things are edited, people who like movies might go to see, when you buy the DVD, there's the deleted scenes. What does the deleted scene do? Well, it's not part of the story in the end, but it does maybe flesh out a little bit of what was missing from the narrative. Sometimes it was cut out just because of time, right? So the Gemara is full. the Talmud, the Gemara is full of not only Mishnayot, but also Braitot. Well, who cares about the Braitot? That's not the authorized version. No, we care about the Braitot because it came from these Tanaim, who we consider the great authorities. And we just want to suck up everything that they have to offer. And sometimes the Amoraim will say, okay, we've identified a mistake in the Braita. That's the Amoraim, we're not afraid to identify sometimes mistakes. But everything else being equal, we want to see it, and then we can think about it, and then we can evaluate it. So Masechet Sofrim is a collection of Braitot. And it absolutely helps to flesh out the picture of everything that we have. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you.
Okay. So let's see again a somewhat parallel description of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai and Masechet Sukkah. Amru is source number 2. Amru alav al Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. They said about him, Mi'amav lo sach sichat chulin. In his life, he never had we'll read the English that's provided, but we'll do a little bit more text and we'll go to the English. Mi'amav lo sach sichat chulin. V'lo halach 4 amot, v'lo Torah, v'lo tefillin, v'lo kidamo adam beveit hamidrash, v'lo yishan beveit hamidrash, lo shenat keva, v'lo shenat arai, v'lo hirher bimvot hamitunafot, v'lo hiniach adam beveit hamidrash v'yatza, v'lo mitzao adam yoshev v'domem el yoshev v'shoneh, v'lo patach adam delet talmidav. Okay, so we'll stop right there actually for a moment. They, the sages, said about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, the teacher of Rabbi Eliezer, in all his days, he never engaged in idle conversation, and he never walked 4 cubits without engaging in Torah study and without donning phylacteries tefillin, and no person ever preceded him into the study hall. In other words, he was the first one every morning. And he never slept in the study hall. Sometimes you go into the Beit Midrash and people are tired. You sit over books, you don't move your body enough, it could put you to sleep. But he never slept in the study hall, neither substantial sleep nor a brief nap. And he never contemplated matters of Torah in alleyways which were filthy with waste, as doing so is a display of contempt for Torah. That's not our point right now. He never left anyone in the study hall and exited. No one ever left after he did. He was the first one in and the last one out. No person ever found him sitting and silent. Rather, he was always sitting and studying, and and we'll go back to the Hebrew in a moment. Now, again, sometimes it could be that the Gemara employs hyperbole. It's a literary work, and when people talk, sometimes they exaggerate a little bit. That's okay. It really doesn't change the point. It doesn't have to be 100% in order for us to get the point, because nobody ever said these things about me, right? So the people that they say this about, they earned the reputation, even if there's a little bit of exaggeration. But the point here is that there was nobody who was as dedicated to his study as Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And now we see a slightly different aspect of his personality. V'lo patach adam delet talmidav elahu be'atzmo. V'lo amar davar shelo shama mipi rabo me'olam. V'lo amar higia et la'amod miveit hamidrash chutz me'avei psachim ve'avei yom kippurim. Okay. And he never left any, and no person, only he opened the door for his students, and he never said anything that he did not hear from his teacher, and he never said to his students, the time has arrived to arise and leave the study hall, except on Passover Eves and Yom Kippur Eves. Okay, so we see also here just a touch of how much respect that he had for the other people involved. For his students, even his own students, he was always meticulous and careful to open the door for them himself. V'chein haya Rabbi Eliezer talmido noheg acharav. I'll just throw that out there, but again, in the interest of time, unfortunately, we can't get too much into Rabbi Eliezer right now, but mark this down for yourselves, that Rabbi Eliezer here is clearly being described as following in the shadow of his teacher. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Shmonim Talmidim ayu lo Hillel HaZaken. Hillel the elder, who we met last week, had 80 students, 80 prominent students. Shloshim mehen ru'uyim shetishre alehen shchina k'Moshe Rabbeinu. 30 of them were worthy of having the divine spirit upon them as was on Moshe. And 30 of them were worthy that the sun should stand still for him as it did for Yehoshua bin Nun, which is a story in Sefer Yehoshua, if I remember correctly, Parak Yud. And so those were the 30 greatest ones and the 30 least ones. Esrim Beinonim, and then there were 20 in the middle. Gadol Shebechulan, the greatest of all of them, was Yonatan ben Uziel. Katan Shebechulan, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. We mentioned Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai as being a student of Hillel. He was the least of the 80 students of Hillel HaZaken. Just a little bit more here, because the Gemara continues to offer us more. Amru alav al Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Shalo hiniach mikra mishnah Gemara halachot v'agadot. This is very similar to what we saw. Diktukei Torah v'diktukei Sofrim, kalim v'chamurim ugzerot shavot kufot v'gimatriot. Sichat malachei asharet v'sichat shedim v'sichat dikalim mishalot kovsin mishlot shualim davar gadol v'davar katan. Davar gadol, that's Ma'aseh Merkava. We'll translate all in a moment. Davar katan, Havayot de Abaye v'Rava. L'kayem ma shene'amar le'anchil o Abayesh le'otzrotehem amalei. P'chi me'achar shekatan b'chulan kach, gadol she'b'chulan al achat kama v'chama. Okay. He said about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai that he did not neglect Bible, Mishnah, Gemara, Halachot, Agadot, minutiae of the Torah and minutiae of the scribes, a fortiori inferences and verbal analogies. These are principles and methods of extracting and extrapolating law from the written text. And, the calculation of the seasons, gematriot, which it says is numerology, calculations based on lettering, conversation of ministering angels, the conversation of demons, conversation of palm trees, parables of launderers. Okay, now here, this is from Sefaria, actually, it's from the Davidson Talmud, the Kohn Talmud Bavli project. So they say, what is parables of launderers? Folk tales that can be used to explain the Torah. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Parables of foxes, a great matter and a small matter. Okay, and the great matter is the Ma'aseh Merkava, the episodes of the Divine Chariot, which is considered the most lofty, mystical, esoteric aspect of Jewish tradition, and the small matter, which is the inner workings of the Gemara. He didn't neglect any of these things, and this was the fulfillment of the pasuk, that I may cause those that love me to inherit substance, that I may fill their treasuries. Okay. And the Gemara concludes, of course, if the youngest, here it says youngest, interesting. If the youngest of them was so prolific, the greatest of them was all the more so prolific. The truth is, I would not have translated youngest, Katan and Gadol that way, and that's not doesn't necessarily need to be translated that way, but that's the way they translate it. Okay, here we saw a description of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, which is very similar, but more expansive than that which we saw in Masechet Sofrim, that he literally simply mastered everything. I'm happy that the small commentary, the interlinear commentary here, again, taken from the Davidson Talmud project, which is available for free online, and it's in print in the Steinsaltz Kohn Talmud Bavli project from the Steinsaltz Foundation, that they explained a little bit what these parables of the launderers are, and the parables of the foxes, and the speech of the demons, and the speech of the ministering angels. I would like to leave it as a little bit more ambiguous. Their job is to not leave things so ambiguous, but really, we know what Mishnah is, we know what Agadah is. When you read this whole laundry list of things, it really sounds like Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is simply just leaving no stone unturned. And more than that, he's dedicated to every source of knowledge possible. I would say He has insights into things that other people don't. And even more than that, really at the end, this verse that concludes it tells us that he couldn't help himself from studying everything. So that you get the impression, we'll see why this is important, perhaps, and if I'm convincing, we'll see why it's important in just a moment. So let's jump back into Masechet Avot. In the second chapter, and please notice, it's Parak Bet Mishnah Chet, right in the middle of the chapter. What happens to the first 7 Mishnayot? We'll come back to that in 12 minutes, God willing. Time me, but don't tell me if I'm off. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai kibel mi Hillel mi Shammai. Okay, in the Gemara we just saw it said that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai learned from Hillel. Here in the Mishnah it says Hillel Shammai. Interesting question. Did he learn from Shammai or not? And I'm not getting into it now. Hu haya omer, im lamadata Torah harbe, al tachazik tava le'atzmecha, ki lakach notzarta. He used to say, if you have learned much Torah, do not claim credit for yourself, because for such a purpose were you created. Okay. Now that I've seen everything that I've seen already about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, I really appreciate such a statement coming from him. He's the one that they whisper behind. He's the one that when he passes, they whisper behind his back. And they're not whispering negative things. They're whispering in awe. He's the one who knows every time he passes. And he knows it. He knows that that's his reputation. He has worked hard to earn it. And what does he say? I'm not so wrapped up in my reputation. I'm just doing my job. Okay, I'll take that from such a person. Now, the Mishnah takes what I would say a quite unexpected turn. And please keep in mind what we said last week about, it was in the very first Mishnah of the whole tractate, of the whole Masechet, which to me is very important. It sets a tone. We talked about the balance between two verbs, kibel and masar. Okay, so Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, in the light that we've shown him just now, the last several minutes, we've seen that he was mikabel harbe ma'od, and he received an enormous amount. And now let's see how he takes his turn at being moser, transmitting that on. And even before we started, Debbie pointed out what's most famous about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai actually, and for us, is probably not even how much he was mikabel, but how much responsibility he took to be the moser. That he founded Yavne, meaning ultimately the era of the Tanaim he began. He started the process that culminated in the writing of the Mishnah. Okay, let's see how that process begins. Chamisha talmidim hayu lo l'Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Ve'eluhein, he had 5 students, and these are their names: Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkonus, Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, Rabbi Yossi Kohn, Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel, Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. Those are the 5 students. Hu haya moneh shivchan. He used to list their outstanding virtues. Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkonus, bor sud sheino me'abed tipa. He is a plastered cistern which loses not a drop. Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, ashrei yoladato. Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, happy is the woman that gave birth to him. Again, unfortunately, we don't have time to delve into each of these descriptions. Rabbi Yossi HaKohen Chassid, he was pious. Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel Yirei Chet, was a fearer of sin. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, Ma'ayan Hamitgaber. He was like a spring that ever gathers force. Okay, and again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read it inside, but he continued to talk about how great Rabbi Elazar ben Arach was and how Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkonus was. It's an interesting interplay, which of them was greater, but each one had a certain aspect of mastery, which was so profound that it kind of outweighed everybody else, all of the other sages. Even at this point, something really should strike us. as much as Masechet Avot, as we said before, perhaps its most prominent feature is that we have so many names, and the teachings are so closely tied to the personalities. As much as that's so, still, the Mishnayot are not telling us stories. We have to go to Masechet Sofrim to find a story. You have to go to Masechet Avot, to Avot Rabbi Natan, which we mentioned last week, and maybe we'll have a little bit of time to do something from Avot Rabbi Natan this week also, if you want to find more biography per se. But here the Mishnah itself tells us something which ostensibly is not educational. What do I get from this list of the 5 students of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, what each of their virtues are? You tell me that somebody's pious, but I've never seen that person. So how do I know how to become pious? Once upon a time, there was a pious person. Great. Hey, let me get my popcorn. No, the story's over. Okay, so what am I supposed to get from that? So what do I get from that? So for me, there are 2 ways, 2 basic ways, and a million, I'm sure, but 2 basic ways that I would approach this question. One is, okay, if I'm told that he's a Chassid, now when I hear something else from Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, I can understand that as reflecting Chassidut. It reflects Chassidut, it encapsulates Chassidut. If I want to be pious, I'm going to zero in on Rabbi Yossi HaKohen's teaching specifically because I know it's a key to piety, or I know that it comes from piety. Okay? So in other words, I know which colored glasses to put on when I'm reading Rabbi Yossi HaKohen's Mishnah. And there is a Mishnah from Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, and etc. for all of them. However, even before we get to that, the other approach is to say, this is not about Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, and it's not even about Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkonos, who's one of the sages who was so great, he outweighed all the others. It's about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And we saw in the Gemara before, after this massive laundry list of attributes as a student of his great achievements as a mikabel, he was particular always to open the door for his students. That's really something. And it's surprising because of this dynamic, the balance between lekabel and limsor. And again, we don't have all the time in the world. But in the first parak, there's a kind of emphasis on, okay, even if le'amid talmidim harbe, that I want to stand my students up, but still, the teacher is the master, and the students have to know their place. For the teacher to go out of his way and open the door for them is already an innovation. That's a new approach to students, which I have not, which is kind of unprecedented. Not only that, here we have in the Mishnah, Moneh Shivchan, that he enumerated the praises of each one. And this was an important thing, not just for that, it's an important process for the teacher himself in somehow achieving. Now, we have to go further, but the picture is enriched by what the Mishnah tells us next. Parak Bet Mishnah Tet. Amar lehem Se'u ur'u ezohi derech yishara sheidbak ba adam. He said to them, go forth and observe which is the right way to which a man should cleave. And to me, this is simply mind-boggling, because what's the job of the teacher? Traditionally, I mean, I'm not even talking Jewish tradition. Normally, you think about, the balance between a classroom. I taught middle school kids, I taught high school kids, and I was encouraged as a teacher, get the kids to do projects, get the kids to do a play of Sefer Breshit. And I said, but how do they make a play? How do they write a script if they don't know Sefer Breshit? Who's going to teach them the Sefer Breshit? I can make a play, which is interesting, but if you want it to be Sefer Breshit, In other words, the teacher is the one who comes into the room with the information. And what does he say? Just again, if you're focusing on language, se'u or u, where are they getting their information from? It's not only that he doesn't say, here's the lesson today. He says, go out. What on earth does that mean, go out? Where are they looking to the answers to their questions? And the Mishnah doesn't tell us at which point he gives them this challenge, go out. So we have a fair question to work through. How much had they already learned at the point when he told them this? And also go out, go how far out? Where exactly are the sources that he's expecting them to find the answer to this question? Be that as it may, right, the answer to that kind of regardless, he's definitely the balance in this, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's classroom has been flipped. He's telling them, you come into class and you present the findings of your research. Today, the information is going to come from you. This, to me, also, if I'm not mistaken, can maybe shed light on what we saw before about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai being a master of the parables of the foxes and this is literally the parables of the laundry people, the launderers. What? I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means, but I'm really not sure at all that that's actually a Torah source. It's wisdom. I think it's wisdom, common wisdom. But Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai being
maybe
so...
parables of the foxes is like Aesop.
Yes, I'm curious. Yeah. I did a little research actually, literally into Aesop once. I don't remember how old Aesop's fables are, what I found, but even if Aesop's fables don't go back 2,000 years, the fact is this idea of, even we said last week, Benjamin Franklin, the book, Poor Richard's Almanac, would not sell today like it did in Benjamin Franklin's time, because of our reading habits have changed. But throughout generations, these little parables and the two-liners, post-epigrams, that was a very valuable tool. That was called wisdom to have, and those things come from wisdom. They incorporated wisdom, even though they weren't scholarly per se. So he's referring. I agree with you completely. I think he's referring to some kind of a tradition of general knowledge, of wisdom, common sense wisdom. And therefore, I think it's not far-fetched for him to say to his students, okay, I've given you the tools. It's hard to say that he hasn't already given them something. We heard that he celebrated their praises. But then he says, now I want you to tell me what you have and what you find. Okay. In the interest
How have
of
you
time,
synthesized it?
and synthesized what?
The knowledge that I've given you. Right.
Yes. Right. Exactly. How have you synthesized it? But I also, they come back to him. They come back to him in the Mishnah. This Mishnah Tet, in many versions it's the same Mishnah, has two sides. He asks them the question both positively and negatively. And that's its own question why he repeats the exercise, basically repeats the exercise almost identically 2 times, in a positive direction and negative direction. He says, go and find something good. And then he says, go and find something bad. And really, they all come back saying exactly the same thing. Saying, Rabbi Yehoshua says, the one thing that a person needs to cling to is a good friend. And the one thing, and when he asks the question, what does a person need to run away from? Rabbi Yehoshua comes back and says the same thing. The one thing that a person has to run away from is a bad friend. There is a lot more to say here, like I said, but in the interest of our hour, can't go into it much further right now. I would like to bring one more thing to your attention in this specific regard, though. And you have here a couple different versions from the Avot Rabbi Natan of what exactly they said, which is certainly worth studying. to me, what is perhaps most fascinating and critical about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is that he poses a question, and then when they present their answers, he assesses them. But the lesson is the question itself. The lesson is that I'm encouraging you to go study. And you need to take what you've learned and you need to apply it. I mentioned before, and we're going to add 2 minutes of we'll go a little bit further for 2 minutes, and then I would like to summarize or recap. Mentioned before that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is introduced in the middle of the second chapter. And that really should raise our eyebrows. It's not what we expected. Because again, as much as we said Avot follows different rules than all of the other tractates, that's true. But at least the first chapter has a very clear rule, which is that we are proceeding apparently chronologically. And the Mishnah is actually explicit in that way. This era, this generation received directly from the era that was mentioned in the previous Mishnah. So when I get to Hillel and Shammai, I'm expecting that the next era is going to be the student of Hillel and Shammai. I'm expecting that to be Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And he's not. He's not the next Mishnah. Not only is he pushed off to the second chapter, he's not even the first Mishnah in the second chapter. Which, like I said, should raise eyebrows. Why exactly is that? What is the first Mishnah in the second chapter? So that's this one right here. Rabbi Omer, Ezohi derech yishara sheyavor lo ha'adam, kol shehi tiferet le'oseha. And I'll acknowledge that there are some different versions here of what that word is supposed to be. Oseha may be osa. I'll translate in a moment. V'tiferet lo min ha'adam. Rabbi. Who's Rabbi? The rabbi? Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. But he calls him Rabbi. Rabbi said, which is the straight path that a person should choose for himself? One which is an honor to the person adopting it, and honor to him from others, which is still actually somewhat ambiguous. The formulation is a little bit unusual, perhaps. But well, maybe we'll just mention Rashbatz because we haven't mentioned him yet. Rashbatz says that the virtue of a deed or the virtue of a path should be determined by what a person knows is right and what seems to be right. In other words, don't do things that seem to be wrong, or at least it's not preferable when possible. Don't do things that look bad, even though they're good. And in other words, don't be satisfied. You should do the things that are good and also that look good, so people don't question you and they don't get the wrong impression. The answer for me right now is less important. What strikes me is this question. Ezohi derech yishara sheyavor lo ha'adam. Now, Rabbi is opening the second parak with a question which is so similar to the question that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai asked his students. He said, Tzu'u ur'u, ezohi derech yishara sheyidbak ba'adam. So, Rabbi, and I point out again, this is not chronological order. Rabbi is the end of the period of the Tanaim. He is the codifier of the Mishnah. His teaching goes first, not because it's chronologically first, but here in the second chapter, his teaching is introduced as a kind of an introduction to the second chapter. And you see that I cut off Rabbi's teaching. Rabbi's other teachings are, like I said, introductions, but he says a number of things which in some way or another summarize or conclude the findings of the chapter. In this chapter, we discuss these issues, but what's more critical, I think more noteworthy in particular, is that Rabbi begins the parak with the question. And that's the point. The exercise is a person has to start to think instead of just following. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's great legacy might be, I have a lot that I can tell you, but before I can tell you, I want to make sure that your brain is working. It's not enough just to be a parrot. It's not even enough just to be a fly that emerges from the water wet. Maybe because the fly anyway is just going to be a fly, and it's just going to take a drop, no matter what. Fly cannot do more than take a drop. So the fly really has to be discerning about how he's going to approach the water. You have to think even before you learn about how you want to learn. And all of the learning that you do, make it as sharp as possible when you approach it so that it is as productive as possible. But sometimes it's not just the answer, or not even primarily the answer. The question itself is critical and determinant. Okay, we have 2.5 minutes. I'll give myself, unless there are questions. Okay, yeah.
If you're sitting in the participant panel, I'm happy to unmute you, especially with people joining in on phone. But there are currently no questions in chat or on Facebook.
Okay, so we'll do a very quick, thank you, Kayla, a very quick summary of what we've seen today in the second chapter. And again, I encourage you to open up the second chapter and look and test me and challenge me, send me a message. The second chapter is presented as a chapter in which the student, we moved from a very high space of the custodians of the Torah, of the whole tradition in the first chapter, to a very personal space of how does a person choose their life values and the trajectory of the decisions that they make throughout life. And that's how Rabbi opens the chapter. Where did he get this from? He got it from perhaps the greatest linchpin in the history of the oral tradition, which is the person of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who had the entire ocean before him and knew that he could only pick out a drop of it. And when he came to his students, instead of trying to soak them completely in the biggest drop that he could give them, rather he encouraged them explicitly to forge their own ways. And he helped to identify. He was ready to identify that each one brought something unique to the table. And perhaps he also therefore expected and encouraged them to, with the awareness that each one is unique, to find through their own eyes the path which is the most productive and most successful for an individual. That's our quick summary.
I wanted to share with you, many years ago, I heard from Rabbi Norman Lamb, Rabbi Lamb, that Zichrono Livracha, he was once talking about the Chafetz Chaim and all the stories about him. And he said, I don't know if all those stories were true, but the stories they tell about him and the stories they tell about Richard Nixon are very, very different. So you get a different picture of him, and that's what's important. So I think that dovetails with some of the things you were saying.
Yeah, thank you.
And then I have one question. So this Mishnah, the one you just finished with, the first Mishnah in Aleph, that preceded what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did.
So good. So if we had more time, I would get into this a little bit more, but I want you to notice that the Mishnah begins with the title Rabbi.
Right.
Who's the editor of the Mishnah? It's
Rabbi
Yehuda
Hanassi. Right.
He would not write a Mishnah and call himself the rabbi.
Right.
He did not edit this Mishnah. And in fact, the next Mishnah is a descendant of his. So there's a little bit of editing going on, which is at the end, very, very end of the editing of all the Mishnayot. And the role here of the editor is as important as the role of the speaker. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is speaking, whenever he spoke He spoke at the end of the period of the Tanaim. And then when the Mishnah was edited, it was edited after that. So this Mishnah is presented to us not because of its chronological sequence, but like as I said, as an introduction to the content of the chapter.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure to hear you teach today, and it's been lovely to hear people's comments. Thank you, everyone who came today. I hope to see you next week. If you want to keep learning with Drisha, we have a class later today at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time with Dr. Malka Simkovich on the law and early Judaism. And if you want to find out more about any of our classes, you can always do so at drisha.org/classes. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you all have a good day.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.